My name is Fernando Reimers, and I am the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. And I direct there the Global Education Innovation Initiative, a research practice collaborative with colleagues in a number of countries, with the goals of helping to transform public education systems so they can empower students with the skills that they need to improve the world. I am delighted by this opportunity created by UNESCO ASP.NET Network to address you as part of this strategic initiative of building a collaborative of teacher education institutions to together learn from one another and figure out better ways, more effective ways to help teachers build the capacity to educate teachers so that they can help achieve SDG 4 in particular, and all the 17 SDGs more generally. In this presentation, I'm going to share some of my work, which I hope you will find helpful and relevant to that task, to the task that you are contemplating. I'm going to share a few slides with you to help me share some of these ideas. So I'm going to talk about preparing teachers to educate global citizens. 5 years ago, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, representatives of governments approved a compact of 17 goals that essentially outline one of the most inclusive and sustainable visions for a future of humanity, of life on this planet where everyone belongs, where we can include all persons and where we can relate to the environment, to the earth, in a way that is sustainable. And one of those goals, goal 4 in particular, proposes that in order to do that, goal 4 is not just one more goal, it is central to the achievement of all remaining 16 goals. Target 4.73 in particular is very pertinent to the efforts of this initiative advanced by ASP.NET at UNESCO, which is to ensure that all learners develop the knowledge, develop the skills necessary to advance sustainable development, including educating them for sustainable development, for sustainable lifestyles, educating them in human rights, gender equality, promoting a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and an appreciation of cultural diversity and the contribution of culture to sustainable development. In many ways, Target 4.7 builds on a historical record of UNESCO leading a range of efforts since the very time when the organization was established at the end of World War II to educate human beings to understand that to be fully human is to extend that humanity in helping others achieve their rights. And when in 1948, the General Assembly of the UN approved this extraordinary document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that articulated 30 rights that we all would commit as a way to improve development and sustainable peace on this planet. One of those rights, Article 26 in the Declaration, outline already a very similar vision to what Target 4.7 is. Look at the language of Section 2 of Article 26. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. This recent book, which you can download on the link which is posted at the bottom of the screen, in the introductory chapter presents an overview of these efforts led by UNESCO, involving many other international organizations, governments, and organizations of civil society to essentially broaden the goals of the curriculum of schools, of fundamental educations, to help people become architects of their own lives and contributing members of the communities of which they are a part. When on March 11th of this year, the Director General of the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, that shattered many of our expectations, many of our efforts to advance in the achievement of the UN SDGs. And there is a very real risk that the crisis created by this pandemic is going to cause some people to forget the SDGs and to postpone the efforts to achieve those goals. And that would be a very grave mistake. It would be a very grave mistake because the pandemic is already augmenting, making visible, accelerating many pre-existing challenges of exclusion, of inequality, of conflict, of tensions within, between countries. And so in that context, continuing and even accelerating our pursuit of the SDGs is even more important. The UN has articulated very clearly that this pandemic is a lot more than a health crisis. It's an economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a security and a human rights crisis that has affected individuals, families, and societies, and that has highlighted fragilities within and among nations. It's no exaggeration. The UN has argued that this response, an appropriate response, will require remaking and reimagining the very structures of societies and the ways in which countries cooperate for the common good. Coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and whole of the world approach driven by compassion and solidarity. In many ways, this invitation to build back better, to build the renaissance coming out of this crisis, speaks directly to this initiative of UNESCO and the ASP.NET network, speaks directly to empowering teachers with the necessary skills to build a renaissance in their own efforts to educate global citizens. Now, I'm going to share with you some of the challenges which I'm sure are well known to those of you participating in this meeting. This is information collected in representative samples of students around the world by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And it's information collected in the PISA assessments and in assessments of teacher practices and characteristics, the TALIS surveys. These data were collected in 2018. When 15-year-olds in schools are asked, to what extent are you satisfied with your life? We see in their responses, number one, tremendous variations. From a very low percentage of 15-year-olds in countries like Brunei Darussalam or Turkey or Macau in China or Hong Kong or Japan who are satisfied with their lives, to a very much higher percentages in Kazakhstan, Albania, Belarus, or Mexico. But we also see that regardless of this variation, in many countries, a significant percentage of students is not satisfied with their lives. For example, look at Korea, where only 57, that is 3 in 5 students, says that they're satisfied with their lives. And we should ask, why? Why at one of the times of humanity in which we have more resources at our disposal are so many students unhappy with their lives? And perhaps this has something to do with their own experience in school and with the way in which their teachers teach them. The same survey asked students whether they had been bullied in school. And what we see in their responses is that a very high percentage of students report being victimized in school by their peers, being bullied. Look, for example, at the high end, the Philippines, 65% of the students report that they have been bullied in school. In the Dominican Republic, 50%. In Indonesia, 45%. In Russia, almost 40%. Some of the lowest percentages are in the Netherlands, in Portugal, in Japan. So why? Why are these wonderful institutions that were invented to make the world better subjecting some students to violence from their own peers? In the same survey, students were asked, does your life have a clear meaning, a clear purpose? And again, we see wide variation, but we see large percentages of students whose lives don't have clear meaning or purpose. Again, to use Korea as an example, for example, close to 70% of the students say that their lives have clear meaning or purpose. But that means that 1 in 3 students don't see a life for them. So how is it possible that at the time when youth is most educated in all of human history, at the time when schools are doing more than they have ever done to help students develop a range of capacities, there are still so many students who fail to develop a sense of purpose, a clear north for their lives? I want to suggest that to some extent that has to do with the way in which their teachers engage their students. Data also collected from the OECD from the Tally survey present a very consistent picture that shows that teachers are very good at engaging their students in teacher-directed ways, in transmission of content, but not so good in engaging their students in ways that invite and promote collaboration among students, students teaching other students, teaching engaging with real solving of problems, with real projects, with activities that require sustained effort over an extended period. For example, when teachers are asked in the Tally survey, when you teach, to what extent do you present a summary of recently learned content? Most teachers do that. Not all of them, but a very high percentage of teachers everywhere say that, yeah, they summarize what was recently learned. Similarly, when teachers are asked, do you set clear goals at the beginning of instruction? Most teachers do that as well. Most teachers convey to their students what they expect them to learn. Most teachers explain how new content and old content is related. And all this is very good for one particular type of pedagogies. In contrast, when teachers are asked, to what extent do you give your students tasks for which there is no obvious solution? Tasks where the students themselves will have to come up with a way to solve the problem. Notice how the percentage of teachers who say they do that drops considerably and how the variation increases tremendously. In the Czech Republic, for example, only 1 in 10 teachers say that they present their students with tasks for which there is no obvious solution. In Austria, very similar low percentage, same in Lithuania. Similarly, when teachers are asked, do you give your students tasks that require them to think critically? Wide variation, much lower percentages than the teacher-centered, teacher-directed tasks. When teachers are asked, do you give your students work that requires them to work in small groups to solve a problem or a task? Much lower percentages, very high variation, right? Look at the United States, for example. Only 3 in 5 teachers, 60% of them, say that they engage their students in problem solving in small groups. Similarly, when teachers are asked, do you ask your students to decide on their own procedures for solving problems or tasks? Much lower percentages, high variation. In the US, less than 50% of the teachers report that they do that. When teachers are asked, do you give your students problems that require at least a week to complete? Much lower percentages, very high variation. I want to suggest that the Sustainable Development Goals offer not only a very ambitious, capacious, inclusive vision of a world that is sustainable and inclusive, but also give us an opportunity to align instruction in schools with developing of the capacities of our students to achieve those goals. And I think this initiative that the ASP.NET network of UNESCO is engaging you in is an opportunity for you to collaborate across different geographies, across institutions, in coming up, in developing and refining approaches to support teachers so they have the skills to develop curriculum and engage in pedagogies that address the shortcomings I have just shared with you and help students build the capacities to achieve these goals. I'm going to share with you some suggestions about what that might mean. These suggestions build in work I have engaged in for the last 10 years, developing curriculum aligned with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, with the Millennium Development Goals, and then more recently with the Sustainable Development Goals. And these publications, which are widely available in a variety of languages, I'm going to take the time to, essentially there are 3 books. The first one is a 350-unit curriculum from kindergarten to high school, aligned with the UN SDGs and with the Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm going to take the time to explain to you how we develop this curriculum. This curriculum is in use in thousands of schools around the world that are either teaching these lessons or that have adapted them to their own plans. I'm also going to take a time to talk about a second curriculum resource, a simplified version of the World Course that contains essentially 5 lessons per grade, from the 1st grade of elementary school to the 12th grade of high school, also aligned with the UN SDGs. And I will not be sharing, but the third resource is a book that compiles 7 different curriculum approaches to advance some of the SDGs. So let me begin with the World Course. The World Course is a course that my collaborators and I developed over a course of 2 years around the following organizing principles. We began translating the SDGs and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into a clear framework of knowledge and skills and dispositions that graduates of high schools should know. In other words, our goal was not simply to teach the SDGs to the students or the human rights, to help them understand what they were, to be able to repeat them. Rather, from the SDGs, we developed a framework of competencies, of knowledge that graduates of high schools should have if we were going to achieve the SDGs. And I'm going to show you how we did that. It is a curriculum, a set of 350 units, as I mentioned, that is progressively organized as a sequence that is largely based on project-based learning, in helping students learn from experience, learn from the experience of doing, of solving problems. The goal is to develop a breadth of skills, not only cognitive skills, but also social-emotional skills, the full breadth of skills that help students understand challenges like climate change, but also understand how they can be a participant to the solution of climate change and help them build the skills to make a difference. This curriculum proposes clear capstones at the end of every year. It's organized around coherent yearly themes. The units are interdisciplinary. It very much includes knowledge that is novel and content that is novel. The goal of this curriculum is to foster agency, the ability and the desire for students to make a difference, their initiative, their leadership. The idea is to teach students to learn from what works, as well as to engage them in learning about challenges that have no easy answer. The goal is to develop innovative and an entrepreneurial spirit, to engage members of the community and parents as resources. The emphasis is in developing high-order skills, analysis, problem-solving, curiosity, exploration, observation, research, writing, the capacity to communicate, to invent. Global challenges, as those reflected in the SDGs and human rights, are very much the focus. The curriculum makes abundant connections between global and local contexts. It engages students with complex issues, messy issues that have no easy answers, or we don't expect that the teachers will be able to give them an answer. It's an age-appropriate curriculum, but it is not infantilizing, and it takes students from that which is personal and immediate to more advanced and conceptual understanding. So, for example, this is an example of how we build this framework of capacities of a high school graduate. We group them into intercultural competencies, which include interpersonal, intrapersonal, and ethical competencies, knowledge and skills, which include the domains of economics, trade and demography, culture, politics, science, technology, innovation and globalization, public health, demography, business entrepreneurship, and social entrepreneurship, and then a series of work and mind habits. For each one of them, we then develop very specific constructs. For example, for the interpersonal dimension of intercultural competency, we identified the following capabilities: the capability to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives, the capacity to understand one's own identity as well as the identities of others, and how culture shapes our identity, where we are in place and time, the capacity to work productively and to lead effectively teams that are diverse culturally, including teams which are distributed in various geographies and where collaboration requires using telecommunication technologies, the capacity to demonstrate empathy towards people from different cultural origins, the capacity to understand and appreciate differences, cultural differences in the basic rules of etiquette, and knowing where to find appropriate norms to specific settings and types of interaction. Similarly, for intrapersonal skills, these are some examples of the capacities that we identified: curiosity about global affairs and world cultures, the capacity to recognize cultural prejudice, and the skills to minimize the effect of bigotry in intergroup dynamics, the capacity to negotiate, mediate, and resolve conflict. Similarly, for ethics, the capacity to interact with people from diverse cultural backgrounds, demonstrating humility, respect, reciprocity, and integrity. Understanding the role of trust in sustaining global institutions and recognizing how trust breaks down um, the capacity to appreciate ethical frameworks in diverse religious systems, the capacity to recognize common values and common humanity across civilizational streams, the commitment to the basic equality of all people, the capacity to value the potential of each person, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances or their cultural origin, the capacity to value the role of global compacts, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in guiding global governance, and the commitment to supporting human rights, to reducing global poverty, to promoting peace and promoting sustainable forms of human-environmental interaction. We did the same thing with each of these domains of knowledge and skills. For example, in economics, we posited that a graduate of high school should understand different approaches, theoretical perspectives on economic development, and how they explain the various stages in economic development of nations, poverty, and inequality, the knowledge of which institutions regulate global trade and work to promote development, familiarity with literature on the effectiveness and limitations of those institutions, the impact of global trade, understanding the consequences of global poverty, and recognizing the agency of the poor. The same for culture. We identified a range of capacities, knowledge of world history and geography, historical knowledge, reflecting different perspectives, world geography, world religions, religious literacy, major philosophical traditions and their points of connection, knowledge and appreciation of performing and visual arts as a way to help find common humanity, appreciation of different arts and their connections, understanding arts as an expression and globalization and art. Similarly, for politics, there were a range of capacities to basically understand civic institutions and to be able to participate in civic institutions. And then finally, for work and mind habits, we identified competencies such as the capacity to innovate and to demonstrate creativity in formulating solutions to global challenges and in seizing global opportunities, the capacity to seek and identify global best practices and transferring those across geographic contexts, the capacity to identify different cultural perspectives in thinking about problems, understanding the process of cultural change and individual variation across groups, the capacity to carry independent research, the ability to present results of independent research, and so on. So basically, once we had that framework, we went from the SDGs to that framework that included about 200 specific competencies that a high school graduate should have. We then went and developed 350 units, a progression, a sequence of 350 units. And what we found with that book, which I mentioned has been translated into a variety of languages and used by many schools, is that it does require fairly well-prepared teachers. And as such, it is an invitation to those of you in teacher education institutions to examine what kind of curriculum, what kind of programs in your institutions would empower teachers to be able to teach this curriculum. But I then developed with my collaborators, listed all here on the cover of the book, a simplified version of that curriculum. And that simplified version, that book, includes essentially 3 tools. The first one is a protocol to design curriculum going from the SDGs to developing lesson plans. The second, a strategy to implement a school-wide strategy for global education. And then finally, an example, a protocol of 60 lessons, 5 per grade, that were basically developed following the protocol presented in the book. Let me take a moment to talk about the school-wide process to transform the culture of an entire school, so that students could gain the capacities to achieve the SDGs. First step involves establishing a leadership team. Second involves developing a long-term vision, studying the SDGs and articulating from that a vision for the school. Then translating that vision into a framework of knowledge, skills, and dispositions for graduates. Then using that framework to audit the existing curriculum and identify opportunities to build on what is there, as well as identify gaps that could be filled with innovative curriculum. Design a prototype of that innovation. Communicate that prototype to the entire school. Then make a decision and put in place an implementation plan, identify the resources to execute on that implementation plan, develop a framework to monitor implementation, develop a communication strategy, design a professional development strategy, execute, evaluate, and then go back and revise. And so essentially what I have described is a cycle of continuous improvement that a school can follow to become better gradually year after year at educating global citizens. But I have also offered a way to make visible the two fundamental hypotheses on which every curriculum is based. See, every curriculum is based on the idea that if we teach a particular set of lessons, our students learn B. Well, they will gain a set of capacities. And if students learn B, which is what is shown in these blue arrows here, if students learn B, then these will produce the following outcomes in the world, the SDGs in this case. In providing a protocol that makes it possible to visibly articulate these two hypotheses and testing it, I've also created a tool that makes it possible to build an improvement network. In this case, you have a network of 6 schools, where every school collaborating in this enterprise can, in one single year, gain 6 years of experience. And I think that this network that ASP.NET in UNESCO is inviting you to build is an improvement network of that sort, where you're each going to be able every year to learn from the experience of others in the network. So let me now talk about a more recent book in which I present 5 frames to develop a school-wide and system-wide strategy to advance Target 4.7 in the SDGs, to educate global citizens. See, when I began this work, when I developed with my collaborators the world course, my view then was that if we change the curriculum, good things will happen. The big discovery after thousands of copies of that book were distributed and thousands of schools around the world began to teach it is that curricula do not teach themselves, that just as important as the curriculum is professional development, and that it was very important to build at the school level a context, an ecosystem that made it possible to support teachers in building the capacities to teach that curriculum. So that is what I built in this book in 60 lessons. What I finally understood much more recently, this book was published in March of 2020, is that we need more than curriculum and teaching. We actually need to see the change process through 5 interdependent frames, 5 interdependent lenses. And you can download this book. It's an open access free education resource on the link that you see there. The book is available in multiple languages. I'm going to describe what those 5 perspectives are. Each of those perspectives illuminates, sheds light on some aspects of the process of change. But at the same time, it blinds us to other important elements of the process of change. Together, they help us understand change in a much more holistic manner, in a more systemic manner. Those perspectives are a cultural perspective, a psychological perspective, a professional perspective, an institutional perspective, and a political perspective. Why do I think those perspectives are necessary? Because in my review of the field of global citizenship education, which is also contained in this book, I have found that most efforts share the same limitations that my original work in the World Course shared, which is basically they present work that can be carried out by a teacher in a classroom. They engage the student experience essentially at the level of the student in interaction with the teacher. So the zone of global education is what is highlighted in red in this slide. But they forget the fact that teachers do their work in larger institutions, and a lot of what they do is influenced by the culture of the school. That is what this instrument tried to change. When I move from individual instructional work to school level work as a way to sustain those efforts. But in turn, what schools do is embedded in larger systems. And I think we need to expand the zone within which global citizenship education takes place from the classroom to the system. We need to expand it to the system. Why? Because if global education remains in the classroom, it's a little bit like putting those yellow sticky notes in at the refrigerator door. they are reminders to students of things that are important, but they don't stick. If we want global education to transform the entire experience of students, to develop the breadth of skills, to educate them as whole human beings, we need to transform the entirety of the culture of the school and of the system. And what this book does is to present a theory that tells us how we can do that. So what do I mean by cultural perspective? Well, the recognition that what schools do is embedded in a set of norms and values that define what kind of work is accepted by school for schools to do and what kind of practices. And those norms define how schools are understood and to relate to other institutions and to communities. And it's very important for any process of change, not simply to do obviously that which is expected. It's okay for schools to expand the zone of acceptance, but it's necessary to do the work of the anthropologists, to communicate with communities. Psychological perspective basically takes stock of the very vast body of knowledge that has been developed in the last several decades about how students learn and how teachers learn, and to use that knowledge effectively in designing high quality curriculum. And so here are two recent publications of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States that summarize what we know about how people learn. And so, for example, if we want students to learn about climate change, it's not enough to transmit to them the facts about climate change. In fact, transmitting the facts and all their complexity may cause some students to become so overwhelmed with the complexity that it will drive them to retreat, to become cynical, to conclude they cannot do anything. If we want to build their agency, we have to translate the understanding of that complexity with opportunities for students to engage in small steps that can help them see a path from their actions to actually ultimately affecting climate change. Third perspective is a professional perspective, and it's understanding that high quality global education is really a professional enterprise that requires the development of expertise among teachers. Frankly, the reason this book is so challenging for many teachers is because they have not been adequately prepared by teacher educational institutions to have the skills and the knowledge to teach that curriculum. So that is the invitation for all of you. In my review of ongoing efforts of global education around the world, I find that teacher educational institutions have a long way to go in terms of providing their teachers with the knowledge, the skills, the dispositions to develop the kind of student-centered, active, collaborative pedagogy, project-based pedagogy, as we saw in the results that I presented at the outset of this presentation. An institutional perspective is understanding that a system is a set of interlocking pieces, all of which need to be in alignment. And it's not enough to just change the curriculum or even professional development. We have to make sure that there is coherence between curriculum, professional development, assessment, instructional resources, and teachers need to build the capacity to create that coherence. And lastly, a political perspective is one that understands that the education system, the school, involves many different people, all of whom have legitimate interests, have their own visions of what is good, of what is a good society. And it is a wise process of educational change, one that takes the time to identify those stakeholders and their interests, and to figure out a way to negotiate those interests, to build a coalition that speaks to as many of those interests as possible so that change is done with the support of those stakeholders and not against them. Let me conclude sharing with you some of my own research on how to help teachers gain the capacities to educate the whole child, to basically develop pedagogies that cultivate the breadth of skills that I have talked about. I have carried out that research in the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which I lead at Harvard University, which is an enterprise with the goal of advancing what we know about how education leaders and practitioners in diverse education systems define and practice teaching and learning that is relevant to the 21st century so that public schools can empower students to thrive. And we achieve that goal through three interrelated activities. We conduct applied research, we promote informed dialogues, and we develop practical tools, such as the ones I have mentioned, that help teachers figure out what to do differently on Monday morning. We have so far published 8 books presenting our research. All of them are empirical studies of existing curriculum, teacher professional development programs, system-wide reforms, national reforms to educate the whole child. And many of these are open education resources. They have been translated into multiple languages. Our most recent publication is a book that has several curriculum to educate students with the capacities they need to adapt and mitigate and revert climate change. I mentioned the book Implementing Deeper Learning and 21st Century Education Reforms. And two of our books, which are the ones I'm going to present in a moment, focus particularly on high quality programs that build the capacities of teachers to educate the whole child. In our informed dialogues, what we do is we bring together practitioners and we develop protocols, practical tools that can help diverse education practitioners learn, make visible the knowledge from experience. Our most recent work are the three publications at the bottom of the slide, a series of reflections from ministers of education that basically led very ambitious education reform, an analysis of the work of about 70 education leaders around the world that were developing innovative ways to continue to educate through the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the right-hand side is a review of reflections of ministers of education in Latin America about the challenges, the leadership challenges created by the pandemic. Two of the publications that you see here speak specifically about teacher education, 15 letters on education on Singapore, and connecting the dots to build the future of teaching and learning. And then lastly, we developed, as I mentioned, practical tools that can be used to help educate teachers. So one of them is this book. This book is an analysis of, it's a series of case studies of high quality teacher education programs around the world that succeed at helping teachers build the capacity to educate the whole child. These are programs in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Singapore, China, India, and the US. The book is translated and published in Spanish and in Arabic. And these programs all reflect an understanding that teachers are adults and an understanding that their learning is situated socially and responding to the current needs that teachers have for learning. The form of professional development involves sustained and many opportunities for teachers to build their capacities, which often extend an entire school year or across multiple school years. In other words, none of these programs are short courses. The modalities of professional development, which these programs have in common, are multiple. They include independent study, discussion with peers, mentoring, coaching, collaboration, experimentation, action research. The curriculum covers a blend of capacities, from a broad focus on helping students develop particular capacities to a much more detailed, granular identification of particular pedagogies and instructional practices that can help students gain those skills. The curriculum reflects a view of learning, which includes cognitive skills as well as social-emotional skills. Professional development includes very specific routines and protocols, as well as more conceptual learning and understanding. These programs rely on a mix of opportunities, many of which are situated in the schools and few of which are outside the school. The organizations that support these programs, many of which are teacher education organizations, build a range of partnerships to enhance the capacity of the schools to bring additional resources, additional expertise to the schools. All these programs studied in this book see teacher practice as situated in specific organizational and social contexts, and they adopt a whole school approach to change, very much like the approach to change that we adopted in the book, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons. All these programs measured in different ways their results. The organizations all model a learning orientation. And then lastly, I want to talk about this book, which essentially extends the research conducted and presented in the book that I just mentioned into 6 programs, much larger scale, 3 of which are national programs of teacher education and 3 of which are large programs implemented in large networks of schools. Most of these also reflect the conception of adult learning that sees it as socially situated and responding to current needs of teachers for learning. They basically provide a lot of this training to teachers on the job, and the programs that work on small networks focus on broader needs of teachers. and build a wider range of capacities. All of them involve sustained and extensive opportunities for teachers to build capacities, very much like the previous study, and these the modalities of professional development are also varied across these programs. None of these are based on a clear theory of how education systems change. I see that as a shortcoming. The curriculum covers a blend of capacities for students and for teachers. All of the programs absolutely reflect an expansion of curriculum goals, and the programs in two of these cases, England and Colombia, focus primarily on cognitive skills. So basically, there are other findings in this book that I think you will find valuable. I think one of my messages to those of you working in teacher education institutions is that engaging your work, looking for ways to better connect initial teacher education with ongoing professional development would help you build this pedagogy. So lastly, let me conclude with this practical tool, a protocol, a very simple protocol that contains 7 steps to help build a continuum to improve teacher quality in any jurisdiction. And it's designed as a protocol that can be used by any organization, including your organizations, in essentially building partnerships to advance collective leadership to strengthen the quality of teachers. Well, let me conclude quoting Terence, the very famous playwright in the Roman Republic. Terence was born in North Africa. He was probably a Berber. He was brought to Rome as a slave to a Roman senator who was so impressed by Terence's talent that he gave him his freedom, and Terence became a playwright. And in one of his plays, he writes, "I am human, and I think nothing human is alien to me." To me, this is the highest aspiration of global citizenship education, is to help teachers and students understand that to be human is to live so that nothing human is alien to me, to understand that we are together in this small planet that we all share, and we are either going to thrive and succeed together, or we're going to suffer and perish together. And I think that the UN SDGs are a very clear invitation, a clear roadmap of what it would take to succeed and thrive together. And the opportunity to build back better in this long night, which has been created by COVID-19, is the opportunity that all of you are taking on of innovating in the area of teacher education, initial and in-service teacher education, so that you can empower teachers with the skills that they need to empower their students to become architects of their own lives and contributing members of their own communities that can collaborate with others along all kinds of divides to improve the world. Thank you very much for the privilege of spending time with you.